Alright folks, today I'm going to present to you another case of environmental storytelling in the Walking Dead universe. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this series, but if not, environmental storytelling is a technique where a series of objects or bodies will be laid out in a way that conveys a story to the viewer without explicitly stating what that story is. In today's video, I'm going to be taking a closer look at the mysterious scene left behind at the Big Spot grocery store featured in the Season 4 episode, 30 Days Without an Accident. I'm going to structure this video by taking you through the story as it was first presented to us, before going back and attempting to piece together the evidence to figure out what happened here. These videos aren't meant to convince you I'm right, just to start a conversation around a small topic in this franchise. We will probably never actually get answers to these questions anyway, so it's all just for fun in the end. If you're enjoying this type of content, be sure to hit that like button and drop a sub to see more videos like this. Six months following the disappearance of the governor, our survivors had built up the prison into quite the community as we're introduced to many new faces such as ex-army medic Bob Stuckey and the young Zach, who both volunteered to accompany Daryl, Sasha, Michonne, Tyrese, and Glenn on a supply run to an abandoned supermarket called the Big Spot that had been converted to a safe zone for civilians during the initial outbreak by the military, which we have seen on many occasions throughout the franchise. Arriving outside the fence, Daryl mentions the entire courtyard had been swarming with the dead the week before, but after hooking a boombox up to a car battery and cutting a hole in the chain link, they all cleared out. But as our survivors crossed through the opening, they would discover only 3 bodies put down with trauma to the brain from what we can see, 2 lying in the middle of the concrete, one of which having clearly been devoured by walkers, and the last lying limp in a large tent. But we also see empty cots with blood on the pillows, indicating some who were either sick or injured had been put down and taken away outside the safe zone. I initially believed this had been the fate of the man in the tent, but looking closer we see a wound beneath the chin, which tells me this individual had more than likely taken their own life when things went bad. But as our survivors make their way to the grocery store's entrance, we unfortunately find out rather quickly things did not end well inside either, as 2 walkers approach the windows. With the size of this place, you would think there would be quite a few more bodies on the inside. Well, as the rest of the group piles in, Bob takes a moment to observe a severed pair of legs left on the ground, and thankfully the source of these limbs wouldn't remain a mystery long, as the camera pans up to reveal a crashed military helicopter on top of the supermarket, surrounded by the walkers of both soldiers and civilians that seem to be putting far too much weight on that roof. But as our group searches for what they came for, we see a shocking amount of supplies left behind on the shelves, which tells me this place fell extremely early on into the outbreak. But having struggled with alcohol addiction in the past, Bob wouldn't be strong enough to resist picking a bottle up for himself when passing by the liquor aisle. And after slamming it back on the shelf out of shame, the entire setup would crash down on top of them, causing the walkers above to congregate in one area and plummet down to the aisles below. Sadly, as a result, the young Zach would be lost to the dead while saving Bob, and while the remaining survivors rush out while leaving him behind, the entire roof along with the helicopter would cave in as the story of the Big Spot is buried in the past. Alright, now it's time to dig that story back up. One thing I found really interesting about this scene, the military were knowledgeable enough to put the sick or injured down after death based on the blood on the pillows, just as we see in Fear the Walking Dead Season 1, as by the time the military had set up the safe zones in LA, they were well aware bites were what killed and inevitably turned you. So logically, going by what we've seen across the universe, the injuries couldn't have been a result of walkers before the invasion, as the doctors were shown to immediately execute bite victims when discovered in fear, not set them up on IVs and waste gauze preventing the bleeding. I initially believed this outside area was acting as a sick bay to separate those infected with the flu unrelated to the wildfire virus, reflecting the sickness arc our survivors at the prison were about to enter. But after searching for what these packets on the ground were, as they are too blurry to make out the words, I found very similar packaging for povidone iodine prep pads, a part of first aid kits. So without any further medical knowledge, I'm gonna assume that's what they are, which would make sense given the bloody bandages bunched up on the cots. So, as much as I'd like the themes of the flu arc to have been subtly foreshadowed in the scene, I think it's more likely there was an event off-screen that led to many getting injured that wasn't from walker bites, based on the evidence the doctors attempted to treat them. Your first thought may be to look at the helicopter as the culprit of these fatal injuries, but with how many civilian walkers are seen on the roof, I think it's more than likely it was being used as a means of evacuation when things went bad. There is no damage or obvious breaches to the fence or perimeter aside from the hole Daryl cut himself, so whatever happened here must have began from within. Regardless, I'm now going to attempt to piece together a story as to what happened here, but again, I am just theorizing based on what I've noticed, so it's entirely possible I could misinterpret or miss some evidence altogether. But like always, this is where you guys come in. I'd love to hear what you believe happened here in the comments down below. As we know, when the dead began to walk on August 27, 2010, the military would set up dedicated safe zones for civilians in major metropolitan areas, but this extended to the more rural areas as well, with a big spot supermarket in a small town outside Atlanta being chosen as one of these locations. More than likely based on its surplus of supplies and high vantage point with the roof, which would be used to land their helicopter intended for surveying the area for surviving civilians. And over the next week, the fences would go up and the camp would be established, with most supplies and civilians being moved inside the store for safety while having strict no looting policies to prevent running out of resources. However, when orders by the federal government were given for soldiers to execute civilians in the beginning stages of Operation Cobalt, those who had spent the last 2 weeks defending these people would refuse, leaving them alone in this new world to protect the scared citizens as no more orders would come through following the bombings of the major cities. Now, again, it's tough to determine how the people in the medical tents were injured if it wasn't from the bites, based off the evidence we previously gathered, but we know this had to have started from within given the lack of damage to the perimeter. So I think I have a couple theories that could make sense. The first, a band of soldiers would head out from the big spot a little too far, intending to survey the area on foot for anything that could be useful for long-term survival, before encountering hostile plunderers that would engage in a firefight. Whether it was out of desperation for what the soldiers had, or maybe anger for what occurred during Operation Cobalt. Regardless, many soldiers would be hit in the crossfire before the plunderers would be handled, leading to a scramble back to the supermarket as those with medical training would try their best to save them to little success. Alternatively, civilians who were severely injured from the chaos of Operation Cobalt would be escorted back to the big spot for medical assistance before overwhelming the doctors. Regardless of who it was, I believe this ends the same. The frantic nature of the situation would lead to negligence and carelessness as the injured would begin to die and turn at a rate that was unhandleable. The biggest issue with this is how many would need to be injured in order for this situation to get out of control. But I believe the identity of the victims being soldiers would help this make a bit more sense, as it would lead to less guns defending from the walkers, but you guys will have to let me know in the comments down below. But what would follow was panic, as the civilians, doctors, and soldiers alike would scramble into the grocery store as the dead were now inside the gates. Some who couldn't get in would opt out before they could become human buffets. But with the lack of corpses left behind in the courtyard, it almost seems like the remaining soldiers didn't even try to fight back. Rather, they were focused solely on evacuation as civilians were being ripped apart around them. The most logical thought for most was to get to the helicopter above for escape. But with the crowd in a full-on panic, there was little to no sense of order. leading to some getting trampled as the masses scrambled their way up the staircase. But once there, it was clear the aircraft couldn't carry them all at once. Some were gonna have to be left behind for multiple trips, which of course would result in violence from the once grateful civilians who were desperate to get aboard, fearing the dead's inevitable break-in through the market door as the remaining soldiers would struggle to take off while fending away the angry crowd. The most likely scenario I can think happened here: the pilot was injured during the riot while lifting off, or maybe someone who shouldn't have grabbed the cycle stick in a panic to get away. Regardless, this would lead to an immediate crash back onto the roof that would kill everyone on board and even more below, while inconveniently blocking the staircase back down, resulting in a horrific choice for the survivors above to either become walker food or jump to their deaths. And with no clear evidence of anybody escaping, I think it's safe to say there were no survivors following the invasion of the big spot. Now, is this interpretation perfect? No, it is not. But I think the scenarios given for the more mysterious aspects of this scene at least make sense logically. One thing I hate doing in these videos is filling in the gaps with speculation without evidence, but with the courtyard walkers having been led away off-screen, we really have no way of knowing how they were injured. But we do know it wasn't from walkers, as people who are bit don't get medical care. Again, the biggest issue with this theory is how this place would get overwhelmed so fast. But without seeing what's in the rest of these tents, I can only assume there are more cots set up for medical assistance. So there really could be walkers around any corner if this happened at night. And we've seen on many occasions how fast things can spring out of control. But whichever way you spin it, it is pretty weird the remaining soldiers didn't take out many walkers on their way up. But this interpretation of the story shows the horrors of a panicking crowd, and how people can turn on you in fear despite your intentions of helping. I'm sure there's something I either missed or got wrong, but I tried my best to incorporate all the evidence we gathered in a way that would make sense, so I hope you guys enjoyed. But please, let me know in the comments what you think happened here, and if you think my theory is accurate or not. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.